Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Atlan is the metadata hub for your data ecosystem. Instead of locking your metadata into a new silo, unleash its transformative potential with Atlan's active metadata capabilities. Push information about data freshness and quality to your business intelligence, automatically scale up and down your warehouse based on usage patterns, and let the bots answer those questions in Slack so that the humans can focus on delivering real value. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Atlan today, that's ATLAN, to learn more about how Atlan's active metadata platform is helping pioneering data teams like Postman, Plaid, WeWork, and Unilever achieve extraordinary things with metadata. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With their new managed database service, you can launch a production-ready MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB cluster in minutes, with automated backups, 40 gigabit connections from your application hosts, and high-throughput SSDs. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today and get a $100 credit to launch a database, create a Kubernetes cluster, or take advantage of all of their other services. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show.
Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Ernie Ostic about Manta, an automated data lineage service for managing visibility and quality of your data workflows. So, Ernie, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure, Tobias. Thank you. Ernie Ostic, SVP of Products here at Manta Software.
And do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Wow. Since the beginning. I started my career 40 years ago with a small software company in the reporting domain, and immediately found myself building data warehouses. Of course, we didn't call them data warehouses back then, but it was building these, extracts for analysis with extracted mainframe data. And I've been intimate with the bits and bytes of transaction and business data ever since.
In terms of the Manta product, I'm wondering if you can share a bit about what it is that you're building there and some of the story behind it and why you decided that this was the problem space that you wanted to focus your time and energy on.
Great story there. First of all, from a Manta perspective, Manta offers what we call a unified platform for data lineage. We provide deep analysis of a customer's application environment, and we deliver insights on how data flows through that environment. We were incubated as a consultative solution in the Czech Republic, almost 10 years ago, and then we expanded into US around the 2016 timeframe. For me, Lineage has been sort of a core part of my career since I got involved heavily in ETL back around the turn of the century. And people were just started thinking about Lineage, but it wasn't really on their minds. It was kind of, almost a religious sell, if you know what I mean. But when governance started to come into play, I started blogging on the idea of Lineage back in 2008. When governance got really heavy in my previous roles, I was with IBM for a long time before coming here about 3 years ago. It sort of became this new passion, and I got introduced to Manta and knew Manta for several years before I got together with our CEO and just said, you know what, this would be a cool place for me to go. I wanted to get back to a small software environment.
In terms of the main focus of the Manta product, I'm curious, what are the core problems that you're aiming to solve and some of the overarching goals of how the product aims to tackle those problems?
The core problems that Manta aims to solve: pipeline visibility. That's really the primary objective for our customers. And three major use cases that we see. And the first is impact analysis and problem resolution. And problem resolution is really all about what happens when things break, right? We have lots of data pipelines floating around the environment. Managers report doesn't appear on their desk, or it comes up blank, or it's zero values. There's going to be phone calls, there's going to be screaming, stuff's going to happen. So how quickly can we determine what went wrong, fix it, and make sure it doesn't happen again? But on the other end, developers that want to be proactive want to be able to say, I'm about to make this change, the change to a table, a stored procedure, an ETL program. What am I going to impact? What might I break? Or what should I be careful of because it will break it? And the very least is just notifying people that there is a change that's coming that could cause an issue. The second and extremely big use case is regulatory compliance, driven a lot by the governance initiatives of the last 10 years. Catalogs are blossoming all over the place, and there are all kinds of scenarios where people not only need to have better trust in the data that's flowing through their environment, certainly a big initiative for governance, but also the regulator comes knocking on their door. and they need to be able to sign off or prove that they understand the data that is being used. They control that data, and without good lineage, there's no way to deliver that. And lastly, we've got a lot of customers that use this for application modernization. Now, what modernization means for them kind of depends on their context. But if they're migrating a legacy application up to the cloud, and that legacy application was built 20 years ago on some particular database, they want to get the ROI of the cloud, but they're stuck because they don't know what they need to move. And Lineage kind of helps them do what I like to call a metadata inventory, right? Understand what you have and which parts of it that you really need to move. There's so many situations where people have, purchased a model 20 years ago. It has thousands and thousands of tables and views and reports and things in it. And there's no real clear idea of which of those pieces they're still using because the subject matter experts have all retired, moved on, gotten promoted. And so, when you really boil it down, they can look and say, wow, out of these original 176 reports, we're only really using these 27. So by doing Lineage on those 27, we can have a better idea of what we should move and not just have to do a complete lift and shift. It's kind of like, looking at the boxes that you have in your attic as you move from place to place to place. And what happens? A lot of those boxes you never open. They just get moved from place to place to place. So trying to avoid that, Lineage will really help.
In the overall data ecosystem right now, data lineage and metadata systems are definitely a very active topic right now. And I'm wondering if you can talk to your view of what that market looks like and the differentiating factors between lineage as a problem category and metadata as an overarching umbrella, and maybe some of the points of confusion that are coming up because of the various different conversations and different motivations and agendas that are percolating through the space, and how you view the role of Manta in that context.
Oof, that's a loaded set of things to think about. But you started about talking about, metadata and lineage being on everybody's tongues right now. And I think my first reaction to that is to say, finally. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but 20 plus years ago, you had to preach the idea of solid metadata management. Nobody cared. Nobody had time. Yeah, people cared a little bit about it, but they weren't really thinking about metadata per itself, right? 20 plus years ago, we were worried about Y2K. And that certainly helped kind of drive the need for metadata definition. But I told you I started blogging about this back in 2008, and Lineage was still a mystery to a lot of people. And so 15 years later, we're still here and the problem still remains. And we have exponential data growth that has, completely taken over many more times than we had back then, and a whole lot more technologies that are doing it. But I would have to say that, trends overall, I think in one respect, governance and catalogs have helped in pushing this and giving people some level of structure and definition, because people want to know what they have and they want to appreciate what it means and where it exists, but also kind of where it flows in their organization. That's kind of a more of a broad brush look at Lineage, but it certainly helps drive it because now business people care about it and it's not just a techie type of thing. There is the whole discussion now that didn't exist before. I think it kind of evolved out of, data quality analysis, but the analysis of privacy, private data, GDPR, all the new regulations that are coming out now, people really have to care about where that privacy data lives. Certainly they want to know because a lot of times it's customer information and they should do a better job of understanding how they're checking their customers. But they also have to be sure that they know for all the rules that come along with GDPR. And people are tracking Lineage simply to answer that problem alone. There's so much attention now to operational runtime metadata. You hear about data ops and observability and being able to see kind of in real time how data is flowing, largely for the problem resolution use case, right? So we can make sure that we can see, hey, there's pipes that are broken. Let's go fix them right now and make sure that nothing goes wrong. But you kind of talk about where things are going and things that have our attention. And I'll kind of get to where Manta fits into that in a moment. But the last piece I would talk about is evolving open source. Metadata initiatives such as Egeria and Open Lineage, Apache Atlas have been coming around now. And I think people just paid lip service to them, but now they finally seem to be making a curve and more people are kind of aware. And, Manta's in the thick of every single one of those cases in terms of our current development as well as how customers are applying us right now.
In terms of the view of Lineage, one of the things you mentioned in there was Open Lineage. I also know that there's the Open Metadata effort, which has its own perspective of what Lineage should look like. And one of the interesting things that I'm curious to dig into is that on your website, one of the things that you call out is Manta is, quote, Lineage done right. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some examples of what Lineage done wrong looks like.
No, great question. Our biggest competitor, and the way I would describe Lineage not done right or Lineage done wrong, is not doing anything at all. And in reality, every single company across the globe, I don't care if they're, 40,000 employees or 4 employees, everybody does Lineage. And the way that they typically do it is good old-fashioned sneaker net and the third grade game we played in class when we were in grade school, the telephone game. And you pick it up and you're, trying to track someone down at this report, something's wrong with it, and at a small place, you can just yell across the wall. I'm going to reach out the door and say, where'd you get this information from? But that doesn't happen in a large enterprise, where someone has to call and say, the CEO looked at this report, something screwed up in it. Can you tell us where it came from? And say, well, I didn't write that particular report, so let me go talk to, Candace. And she's not around right now, but I'll leave her a voicemail, or now that we're all remote, she's in Europe somewhere, so it's 6 hours ago, so we'll have to reach her tomorrow. And then it just goes on and on and on and on, all the way down the line. And so Lineage ends up taking forever. I love going through that kind of interview with people and say, how do you do Lineage today? And, most people laugh at me because they go through that whole rigmarole. And I always ask them again, well, then how long does it take? And, delay in trying to make a decision is significant, or the trust that someone has in that particular data. So they're either doing it in such a fashion that they're not really doing it at all, so it's not really effective, or they're doing it manually. They're bringing in all kinds of consultants, or they have somebody who's full-time just chasing down spreadsheets and trying to come up with their own, textual lineage results and historic forensics, really, on the lineage, that they can't deliver the kinds of information they need in a short period of time to do the use cases we just talked about.
As far as the problem space of data lineage, one of the ways to think about constructing it is by saying, okay, I'm going to build the data lineage graph based on the tasks that I am explicitly executing in my workflow orchestration engine, or I'm going to build this lineage graph based on the query log in my data warehouse to understand what are the queries that are populating different tables from which tables, et cetera. And I'm wondering, what are some of the gaps in the overall view of Lineage that are prone to come up when you're using that view of how do I construct this lineage, and some of the ways that you think about both leaning into direct integrations where I'm going to use this tool to push lineage information, but also the cases where I need to actually go out and crawl information to build the missing pieces of that lineage view across the entirety of a data system.
Fantastic question, and one that, we work with quite a bit here. Manta is really known for our core competency of being able to go out into code, existing SQL code and ETL and reporting code, and actually chewing through it and coming up with the actual lineage and the transformations. But runtime lineage is also a very important thing, and being able to go into logs. In fact, this is something that we've started to invest heavily in as we get into the deeper research into things like Open Lineage, which is very event-oriented. And one of the concerns that we have for exclusively event-oriented lineage is that there are things that could be missing, right? So by not having all of the current code that's currently operating, if there's something that only runs once a year, then you may not have a record of that. And, of course, then you get into ideas of how long do you keep your logs around for, and can we afford to save all that disk space? And so, a particular process that ran only at the end of Q1, and now it's, the middle of August, and that thing only runs again at the end of the year. I have no record of it because I don't have those logs anymore. So we're worried about missing holes. Another thing that, is really important is to be able to do the impact analysis before code's ever in production. So during the design process, either because I'm doing an update and doing maintenance, or during an early part of the construction of an application, I want to see what the lineage looks like. And with code analysis, I can do that right up front. We also have customers that look at prototyping and actually laying out what will lineage actually look like before I've even written a single stitch of code. And Manta provides the ability to be able to do that, things that could not be done until I've actually run a process. And we really want to move the lineage ability in both directions, right? Move it in the direction so that it can be powerful in a runtime scenario, but also move it in the direction so that an architect can start to lay out what the lineage is before anyone has actually put a finger in their IDE.
That sounds like a dangerous operation. It's almost like sticking it in the light socket.
Yeah, right.
Digging a bit more into the work that the Open Lineage team is doing and just the overall concepts of what pieces of information do you need to be able to have a useful and comprehensive view of lineage is what are the attributes that are necessary to be able to be tracked consistently across the board from all the different systems that you're working in, and what are the attributes that are nice to have because they provide extra context but aren't a core requirement to be able to actually operate on the lineage graph that you're building.
Yeah, great point. And one of the things that we're excited about with Open Lineage is that it's going to provide an opportunity for vendors to sort of prepare other people for consuming lineage from their solution right off the bat. And that's important, especially for newer vendors that are, trying to put their footprint in the market and they want to get out there, and Open Lineage can give them a really nice checkbox to go ahead and do so. At the very bare minimum, the events of what you wrote to and what you read from and what is the object. Is it a notebook? Is it something you call a job? Is it something that you call a workflow? I mean, everybody's got a different word for it. But in the end, it's probably reading something and writing something. You take the Spark world and it's a data frame. If it's a piece of code that's pulling JSON documents out of Kafka and pushing them into MQ series, right? That's a whole other paradigm to look at, but it's still reading somewhere, writing somewhere. And so you need to have at least those three things. What is doing the reading and writing? What am I reading or writing from? And what am I writing to? Now, everything changes when you start to dig deeper into that, because that's the least. And that could be more than good enough for a lot of situations. But the next question that comes along is, well, can you tell me which column it is? And for a lot of those different use cases, you can. So columns become sort of the next level, but it's not like the MVP, or it's not the bare minimum. Bare minimum, you need this thing it's writing and what it's writing to. Then I want to get into columns, all right? Understand if it's, some complex JSON schema, of course I can dive into the columns. If it's a database like Snowflake, of course I can get into the columns. But then there's also lots of gray areas where that can't be true. Or you get situations where it's completely unstructured. I had a customer ask me the other day, how do I track the MP4s that I'm moving around on different locations within Amazon S3? Well, there's no columns in an MP4, right? So things change, but you have to kind of look at it. So back to your properties, right? So got to know what is writing from and what is actually doing the work. We potentially want to get down into columns if we can. It's kind of like a luxury if you can do that. Then the next step says, okay, can I get exactly the details on the time? I want to know time it ran. If it only ran every 6 months, like my previous example, is that important to me? Maybe I only want to look at the lineages in the last, week, because everything else is immaterial to me. And then start to get into the really cool optional stuff, which is how many records did it actually load, right? And so when you get that question from the manager who's looking at a report and he's not sure he should trust it, knowing when it was loaded, but also exactly how many records were loaded might give him some indication or validations. And so as you go further and further and deeper, those are the kinds of things that you get. When you get into the real luxury items, you want to know a little bit more about the data quality score that went along with it. And in fact, was there a check against the different algorithms that were run during that particular transformation? And finally, and this is where we get more into design lineage, It's picking up the actual transformation expressions themselves, right? There are use cases where someone says, I need to see the actual rule that was used to come up with this particular calculation. And without looking at source code, that becomes very difficult to do.
I think it's interesting that you are factoring some of the data quality and some of the observability elements into that lineage question, because in a lot of the conversations I've had, they're generally disjoint because mostly the vendors who are trying to work in those different spaces haven't started to edge into the overlapping areas. And it's all metadata at the end of the day, which is another interesting element of your core focus, or the way that you're advertising your product is around this concept of lineage, but you are branching out into just broader metadata and things that wouldn't necessarily be considered lineage by a number of people who are at least passingly familiar with the space. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit to some of the maybe the product design or the ways that you and your team are thinking about lineage and data quality and metadata and just the overlaps, and how each of those may be potentially disjoint and how you think about the boundaries between them, or if that is an artificial construct and it's actually natural to say data quality and data lineage are actually part of the same system, not even two sides of the same coin.
They're definitely super tightly related. And I think one of the most interesting discoveries that I made when I was first getting into Manta was working with one of our customers who had their own quality analysis work. And they used a feature, at that time, a very little known and little used feature of Manta, to stuff their own custom data quality scores back into Manta. And in Manta ourselves, we're focused on code. We don't look at data, right? There are lots of companies out there who do a fantastic job of reading data, and we're starting to partner with some of them. Some of these blossomed out of this idea that came out of one of our customers a long time ago. So they took data quality scores and they put them into the actual nodes of Lineage that Manta was already scanning and reporting on. So if they can take a data quality score, they would actually put it into, let's say, an Oracle table that they had detected, which is now in the middle of a lineage path. And so that the user who was looking at this lineage could then go see, oh, well, last night's data quality score for this particular table or this particular column is, 87. All right, that's a good score. But if the score shows up as 42, then there's something wrong here. And, the analogy is basically saying, and what this user had kind of outlined for me, is that if I have a lineage, and it's like if I drew it on a whiteboard, complex picture with all kinds of boxes and lines, if I had yellow or red sticky notes that I could stick onto that lineage in the particular places where they're appropriate, I could have a better idea of judging which of these data quality problems I really should address first, which ones lead into other ones, and possibly set up prioritization on which of these I should address first. It actually inspired us to create a feature that we call active tags. So users have this ability to add metadata into Manta, and we can put in an active tag that recognizes it in the visualization and actually puts a big fat red icon on whatever column or whatever piece it is that particularly score corresponds to. It has since inspired integration that we have been working on with several of our partners whose core competency is not lineage, but they're very good at diving in and coming up with all kinds of algorithms that analyze data in terms of quality or in terms of privacy.
And now, digging more into the Manta platform itself, can you talk through some of the implementation of how you've approached this challenge of being able to build and maintain these lineage graphs and provide these insights, and some of the overall design and capabilities of the platform and how you went about building them?
Sure, absolutely. Manta started as a code analytics tool for helping with code standardization. And it became very clear that in the work that we were doing there, being able to lace together, column to column, source to target types of pictures and streaming with edges for connecting lineage and all the different nodes was something that we could make use of in this growing governance space. And that's kind of how we first got started. And in doing so, really being able to help customers that were doing work in governance early on, 6, 7 years ago, who needed to be able to examine the code that they have. So that gave us an opportunity to say, well, what code are you talking about? Well, in so many cases early on, it was about their analytics systems. So the fallout of the list of technologies we needed to support became very clear. Relational databases, Teradata, Oracle, etc. The ETL tools like Informatica and DataStage and Microsoft SSIS that move data between them. And of course, the reporting tools that are out there, the business objects and the cognoses of the world. Well, fast forward, we had to build teams that were able to work on the actual analytics, right? That hardcore work to figure out exactly how does data flow through a particular tool? What does its metadata look like? How does this column flow into that column? Number one. The merging ability, because one of the keys to our customers getting end-to-end lineage is how do you reconcile through a target? You have a stored procedure that's in Oracle that writes to 6 different tables, but then the ETL tool, like Informatica, has to read from those tables. So somehow you have to reconcile that you understand that, okay, tool X writes to a table called person, and tool Y reads from a table that's called person. Well, that's fine if it's Oracle, but what if it's a sequential file? Maybe it got copied and renamed. But ultimately, being able to reconcile that is all part of our platform. But the real key then is, how do you then show it to users, which is a real key for us, is making Lineage easier to consume and do it in a way that's performant, right? So it meant an evolution of the technology that's under the covers. We used to put it in a relational database. It ran out of gas because the kind of customers that we're talking to, they have massive amounts of Lineage metadata. It ran out of gas. We moved to a graph database, right? We put it on a graph database. Finally, it ran out of gas. It was an open source graph database, good one, but couldn't handle the kind of volumes and performance that we needed. We've since, gone through the engineering to put the premier graph database, Neo4j, it's public, underneath the covers because we needed the kind of radical performance that people who have hundreds of millions of connections in their lineage and still would be able to get performance when they're loading it. And of course, when they're retrieving lineage information for their research. So that's just a few of the areas, but our platform, and that's the reason we call it a unified platform for lineage. It's not just about pretty colors and laying out the lineage in a graphical fashion, but all the research that you need to do and the infrastructure needed to support it. I think the last thing I'll say is that as new technologies come out, feels like there's a new one every week that's ETL tool or reporting tool on the web, or old legacy scenarios. Still get, products from when I started my career that people want to do lineage for, even if it's just for a small number. And so, being able to expand, our team is able to study a new technology and then decide how to support it best within this paradigm. And that includes Open-Lineage.
Big Eye is an industry-leading data observability platform that gives data engineering and data science teams the tools they need to ensure their data is always fresh, accurate, and reliable. Companies like Instacart, Clubhouse, and Udacity use Big Eye's automated data quality monitoring, ML-powered anomaly detection, and granular root cause analysis to proactively detect and resolve issues before they impact the business. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Big Eye today to learn more and keep an eye on your data.
As far as the interesting challenges that you have come across as you've grown the size of your customer base and been exposed to more varied operating environments and varied requirements, I'm curious, what were some of the, interesting surprises that you encountered as to, wait, people want to do what with Lineage? Or they want to store what information? How? Just some of the kind of discoveries that you've made along that path that have directed the focus of your product and the evolution of its implementation.
I think that the mention that I made earlier about moving MP3s or MP4s around from place to place is an example of one of the surprises. And what I mean by that is, people come to us, they just purchased an ETL tool, that's new on the market. And I'll go back 2 years. We're about to release a scanner for Azure Data Factory. And, 2 years ago, we had customers saying, okay, you guys do Informatica, you do all these other ETL tools. We really, really like Azure Data Factory. Is that one you can put on your list? Talk to enough people, you weigh the market, because you put it on your list. But we would get requests for things like, well, we want to have you scan Amazon S3. And of course, our immediate question always is like, but there's no lineage there, right? The lineage to S3 is done by Snowflake. It's done by Informatica. It's done by DataStage. It's done by people's Python code, right? So there's no lineage in S3 itself. And people have said to us, but you guys do lineage. We have stuff out there that we want to be able to track. And so for us, and this isn't the only thing that we've been exploring lately, but it's one that I think that we're excited about now delivering, is more generic things so that people can build lineage that they need for things that aren't necessarily scannable. I mean, I had somebody ask me about, well, I have FTP scenarios that people still FTP manually. Well, there's no scanning of that. Somebody gets in, they log in, they run an FTP, or what's there to scan? There's nothing to scan, but you still need to be able to illustrate that kind of lineage. So one of the things that we provide for people is the ability to build their own lineage and do it as easily as they can. Yes, we want huge percentage to be automated, because if it's not automated, then what are you going to gain? But there's always those little snippets and pieces that you're going to need to be able to take the lineage from somebody's head. What are they thinking about? And be able to illustrate that lineage, because the subject matter expert's the only person that knows that this particular, we'll use the MP4 example since it's so obtuse, knows that these MP4 files that have to do with, I don't know, human resources and all of the in-person interviews that we do have to get moved from here to here as we, go through the recruitment process. That's something they want to track for lineage. It's personal data. There's 100 other things that it might go along with. And it simply needs to be drag and dropped and establish lineage without it. So I think that that's been one big surprise for sure.
And so as far as the process of getting onboarded onto Manta and integrating it into an existing data platform, what is involved in actually being able to both push the lineage metadata into the Manta platform, as well as being able to do that discovery of these various different assets and how they're flowing through the different workflows, and maybe some of the design and modeling considerations that go into how you want to compose your different lineage subgraphs?
Well, basically, for a person to get started with Manta, they install it. Today, it is a on-premises solution, although we're very close to releasing our first fully SaaS offering. But ultimately, in either case, somebody has to sit down and decide, okay, what is it we want to first look at for lineage? And, our customers will typically have some particular path that they need to take, right? A large bank wants to support their risk department, and their risk department is, doing analysis on commercial loans. So they have a set of technologies that support them. There may be a data warehouse or other scenario that's sitting in Oracle with data at some particular point in time. That data is being manipulated by some ETL tools and gets put up into Snowflake. Maybe from Snowflake, it's being read by a tool like Tableau. So it's just a couple of tools out there. But if they're examining that particular application, it already gives them sort of a subset of which tools they need to focus on. So they might say, okay, we're going to start with Oracle. So the first challenge is, which Oracle database do we need? Can we get there? Establish what the credentials are. Can we get there directly? And can I deal with the internal politics? You name it. Somebody's going to say, well, I don't want you accessing that particular database at this particular time. Or I'm not going to give you credentials to that database because you're not allowed to actually take a look at it and see it. And this really depends on who's driving the lineage requirement and how high up in the organization do they have sponsorship. But ultimately, connectivity becomes one. Which schemas do we care about? Do we want the whole database? Do we want all 22,000 assets that are in it? Oh, we only need the commercial loan stuff? Okay, well, the commercial loan stuff is these two schemas. All right, so we start to focus on that. That all is kind of a one-time thing. But of course, depending on how many firewalls there are or permissions that you get, that could be a a 5-minute exercise, or it might take you 5 hours as you chase down, the politics within your organization. Ultimately, Manta goes out, does an extraction, and pulls out all the pieces that it's necessary and performs that analysis and puts it into the graph database where it can now be reviewed. The next kind of challenge that people go through is to say, okay, fine. Now I have all this Oracle lineage. I have all those pieces. Let me move on to the next tool in the process. And so they're going to go through the same thing. But as I did mention at one point earlier in the call, and once I bring in the ETL tool, let's say that it's a data stage ETL tool, then it's got to read from the Oracle table. So we got to make sure that there's a reconciliation and meshing. The data stage tool call the Oracle system something different. Okay, then we have to have settings that can figure that out. But once you figure out how the Oracle system is called, pretty much everything else is down the line, simply because at least most tools in this marketplace will look at a database and understand database schema, table, column. That's all the same. I just got to figure out, well, this guy connected with ODBC, this guy connected with JDBC, this guy called the resource, commercial loan prod, and this one called it commercial loan P. Okay. Once you reconcile that, the rest is the same. So it's kind of like one-time settings. From that point, it's just going to work on. So those two things are crucial, and that continues as you go through the pipeline. I think the next things that people start to look at is, well, how often? How often do we change this code? And the Tableau reports might be changing daily, but that Oracle database written 10 years ago, maybe not so much, right? So maybe we don't have to scan that one as frequently. And, so they start looking at timings like that. That helps.
As teams are going through this process of onboarding different systems and maybe integrating custom lineage information for different sources that aren't supported out of the box, what are some of the points of friction that they're likely to run up against, either because of some of those internal politics or because of some of the technical requirements that are inherent to being able to collect and maintain this information?
So great point. When we get into a hybrid scenario, right, you've got a lot of automated lineage, and then there's some pieces that need to be bridged. Bridged because the technology that Manta doesn't support, or it might be some technology that we do support, but it was a new feature that was put into that utility and, we don't support it yet. Or like the MP4 example that I brought up earlier. So the first thing is to kind of follow a methodology, which is, what is it that my user wants to see? And, if it's some particular, let's say, homegrown ETL tool that has been in the company for a long time, asking what your user wants to see is important. Kind of comes back to the discussion that we had earlier about attributes. So does your user, Mr. Report Writer or the CEO, if she wants to actually, see column information, what do they actually need to see in terms of the lineage? If they only need to see that it came from this application, goes to that application, that may be as deep as you need to go. And some people have asked us for super high level lineage. But if I have a technical person involved, they might say, well, I need to know exactly which ETL program, which workflow it actually was, and maybe which module within that workflow. Okay, that's fine. But if you want that kind of lineage and you need to do it manually, that means you have to dig deeper. It's going to be a little bit more complex. You do application to application lineage. You could sit someone down with a CSV file in Notepad or Excel, and they could just draw up the lineage in an hour. The subject matter expert could just lay the whole thing out. But if you need to get into the depths of the individual modules, or you want individual column lineage, or you want transformations, now you have to find out, where do I get that information? Is it even accessible? Right? So you have to decide, where can I get that from? Is it in a spec? Is it in some metadata somewhere? Or is it, again, up in somebody's head? And finally, the last question I think needs to get asked when you get into those hybrid situations is, how many? My favorite example on this one is somebody did ask me about EasyTrieve, which was a mainframe JCL-based report writer back from the 90s. And they said, well, we only have 27 reports, and we are going to replace them at some point with Tableau. But we had 18 months that we need some lineage. And I said, well, if it's only 18, how often do they get edited? And they laughed at me, because they're from the 90s. They're not getting edited at all. All right. So once you know what the volume is, then you can decide, is this something that I can sit a subject matter expert down in front of a spreadsheet and just lay out what the lineage is? Or should I start thinking about writing my own parser similar to what Manta does, but for this old technology that probably Manta nor any other third-party vendor is going to bother writing Lineage for. So do I have to go through that exercise? Well, if it's only 27, no. What's the threshold? Probably somewhere between, 100 or 50 and 200, right? And when somebody says, well, we better do the effort of writing a little program to parse through this because that's just too many to have someone, update on a manual basis. I think that's a good opportunity for me to talk quickly about partners. We have partners who build scanners for technologies that they're really deep experts on, and yet we have not had a chance to write because of resources or the market or the number of customers. In fact, we've already listed some of these on our website. One of our partners wrote a scanner for DBT. We didn't have that yet, but we provide the facility for them to go ahead and do so and inject that lineage. And so that expands our footprint.
Once you have a lineage graph built, that's all well and good. You can go in and point and click around and say, oh, this is fancy. I can look and see things. But I'm curious how that materially impacts the work of the different stakeholders of that data and some of the ways that it gets factored into their workflows or integrated into their tool chains to be able to provide some of those rich insights or detailed debugging capabilities as you are building and scaling and maintaining a data system.
So for us, the visualization is certainly the flashy thing. It demos well. It's nice to actually go and see. But when we talk about the workflow for the different people, certainly either not the decision makers, but probably the people that support the decision makers are going in to look at Lineage that way. I've talked about developers who might go in and look at a stored procedure, see how it's going to impact things downstream. But all of the lineage that you see visually is also accessible through APIs and other methods that you can go get access. So in some cases, people will actually have a predefined program that will go in and do a comparison for a particular object and actually see what the lineage looks like between this week and last week, and not use our GUI to do it, but get an extract that they can look through programmatically to actually say, okay, I'm watching this particular stored procedure. I see that it actually changed, right? On a, Manta finished its scan. So I kick off this program that goes ahead and automatically checks the lineage and then can send an alert to someone that says, hey, Tobias, your stored procedure that you cared about has changed, right? Manta's flagged that. We got it through an API. You might want to go look at it or go ahead and do things. So it's not something that is exclusive to looking at from a visual perspective. And so how does that affect a person's daily workflow? Well, in some cases, you might get an alert that tells you about something, and you might not even really care about Manta for that matter, because it's going to be something that's done behind the scenes. And then for other cases, we have people that go into, Manta on a regular basis. And it's why we continue to look at ways to make Lineage easier to understand with color coding and abilities to what we call basically aggregate the lineage, right? You can see it at a higher level.
What you were talking about, being able to see the changes in that lineage, brings me to another interesting capability that I noticed while I was preparing for the show is the versioning of that lineage graph. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the motivations for that and some of the use cases that it unlocks, and just why is that an important feature and what extra capabilities and value does it provide for being able to have that versioning and be able to go back in time and see what was the lineage at any given point.
I'm so glad that you asked. That is certainly a key thing that has been in the Manta architecture since day one. We call it revisions. And what it basically is a complete slice across all of the assets that you're scanning, where we are able to compare what the lineage of a particular object looked like this week versus last week or last quarter, or when that report person who's dealing with the regulators comes into your office with their hair on fire and says, oh my gosh, I have to see what the lineage looked like on December 31st of 2021. Okay, fine, let's just go. Let's click here, boom, open up the lineage revision that we did on December 31st, and here you go. Here's all your lineage. So they can actually see what it looked like at that point, but also to be able to compare it. So we do a comparison that allows you to see how the lineage has changed. And what that usually leads to is a property or transformation change that occurred upstream. It could be as simple as being able to see, oh, look at this. This stored procedure or this ETL last quarter was reading from these 3 columns in our data warehouse, and now it's reading from these other columns. Well, which one's right or wrong? Well, somebody made a decision that in this giant data lake of ours, there was some redundant data and we were pulling it from the wrong place. Okay, that's one possibility. One of our customers has a packaged application where they have a schema. It's got, hundreds of tables in it. And their biggest concern or issue that they have is every time this application vendor puts out a new release, it breaks a lot of their custom reports. So they actually use it to compare the schemas of that particular source. And in their case, they're not really using it for Lineage. You talk about surprising uses for Manta. They're using it just to compare properties that are in this entire schema of tables that have been added or changed from the prior scenario. And our technology can do that too, right? And being able to do it within the context of Lineage helps them out because of the reports that they fear are going to get screwed up when schema changes come and they didn't know it.
Prefect is the data flow automation platform for the modern data stack, empowering data practitioners to build, run, and monitor robust pipelines at scale. Guided by the principle that the orchestrator shouldn't get in your way, Prefect is the only tool of its kind to offer the flexibility to write workflows as code. Prefect specializes in gluing together the disparate pieces of a pipeline and integrating with modern distributed compute libraries to bring power where you need it, when you need it. Trusted by thousands of organizations and supported by over 20,000 community members, Prefect powers over 100 million business-critical tasks a month. For more information on Prefect, go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/prefect today. That's PREFECT.
Another interesting use case for maybe the versioning, but especially the automated discovery of data lineage is that when you're doing that discovery, it will help to understand, okay, what are the source assets that are being fed into my system and where are they going? And I'm wondering if there have been any examples of the discovery of those source assets being something that led to an aha moment in the sense of, oh, shoot, that never should have been fed into this system, and just some of the ways that this lineage information can surface potential mistakes or compliance issues because of the fact that certain data sets are maybe being consumed downstream where they should never have left the system that they were originally stored in.
My favorite example of that has been in this growing area of concerns about privacy and PII data. And, it helps to back up a little bit and think about Lineage, right? And, for any listeners that haven't actually played with any Lineage tool, ours or anybody else's, there's typically kind of an idea that I like to refer to standing on an island when you ask for Lineage. Because you're typically asking it for it from the perspective of some object within your world. So you're standing on a report. So when you ask for Lineage, well, typically the report is at the end of the stream or at the glass, as people like to say. So everything is going to be upstream, right? Or to your left, if you're talking about a typical left to right paradigm. If you ask for something in the middle, you'll see Lineage in both directions. You ask for it and you're way over at a source, everything's going to be in the other direction. So again, that's why I say standing on an island, what is your perspective when you request Lineage? So in a scenario where I have a customer report that's completely packed full of, personal information, I know it's got personal information. So one thing I might do is do a Lineage and look upstream. And that might show me all the lookups in the source tables and transaction systems it comes from. But now, once I've found one of those tables, it's so eye-opening to then switch the gear and stand on that location on the island. So now I'm way over on the left, right? And I say, show me Lineage. And of course, it's going to show the other reports. But this is what's been really interesting at sites that have now had their eyes open to say, oh, not maliciously, these aren't breaches, but we've been spraying customer information to audit files, extracts, and 20 other places that this information should not be going anymore. And that's a perfect example of the sort of awakening that people have. There's been other scenarios too where people will find a lineage that goes back to a table in their data mart or data warehouse. And then there's no lineage on the other side. And they think, well, wait a minute, who's loading that? And they've had to then go do some investigation to find out, in fact, there's a whole nother system where people have been loading this table and you didn't even realize it. And so you get these situations, and we have APIs to do so, to look for what are objects that you have that have no lineage at all, right? There's nothing connecting them. So who's using it? It's like it's an inert object in the middle of your environment. Or scenarios where it's got hundreds of outbound connections, but no inbound connections. Now, that means something isn't being scanned, and it kind of opens up some new discoveries that have to be made.
Throwing you a bit of a curveball here, most of these conversations around data lineage and lineage systems are in the analytical context where I want to understand what are the data flows from an application database table through to a Tableau report, for instance. But another case where you have data flows that can be challenging to map and understand what are all the different usages of this piece of information is in the systems operations context, where I have a configuration element that maybe has a database password that is then getting passed to an application somewhere, or I have some attribute that says this is a certain piece of information about an operating environment, and these are all the different places where it needs to be used to be able to make sure that everything gets linked up properly together. And I'm curious if you've ever seen Manta or similar systems applied to that context, where I am a systems engineer and I want to understand what are the configuration elements that are being used in which locations and how are they being propagated.
I would say that that's a place where people have looked to subject matter experts to sort of paint a higher level metadata picture, because a lot of those things aren't necessarily something that is so easily parsable, right? It'd be neat if we kind of addressed our technology there, and I think that we could. But where I've seen that potentially come up is with our customers that really want to do planned metadata. And so they've discovered this, and instead of putting it into Visio or PowerPoint, they want to put it into Manta so that it can be seen within the context of the lineage that they are doing automatically. But that would be a place where I would say it's probably mostly manual.
Just thinking about that, because as somebody who is also responsible for running infrastructure, it's always interesting to try and look and see, okay, what are the cases where this piece of information is not actually getting used anymore and I can just delete it? Or what are the cases where this piece of information is dependent on everywhere and maybe I need to refactor that into a single canonical reference and everything, else pulls that from a key value store or something?
For sure. Yeah, there's some definitely interesting lineage paradigms that, we toy with exploring a little bit more. One is process lineage. And I think we may start to see that as we play with Open Lineage. But process lineage, like not really how the data flows, but what's the actual execution of a sequence of things in Uzi, in the Hadoop environment, or, old legacy scheduling tools that you still see out there once in a while, Control M, et cetera, where the flow between nodes is not a flow of data, but it's a flow of control. Run process A. If process A finishes successfully, it's going to run processes, X, Y, and Z. But if process A fails, it's actually going to run process Q. And, I want to show that potential behavior and have it laid out as it's specified, not just from a runtime perspective. And then I've been getting requests recently, especially with all the work that's going on with containers, of, what is the arrangement of containers within this whole Kubernetes infrastructure that I have? And how do they call each other? And that's solving another different kind of need, but it's certainly something that we want to explore.
We've brought up a few different interesting use cases, but I'm curious if there are any other examples of interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen Manta used.
Brought up a couple of them so far. I thought that creative customer that was injecting data quality scores into Manta was a really creative use that we've seen. Some of the time checking, right? So in terms of traveling in time idea, right, with the revisions that we talked about before, have been some of the other really creative situations.
Well, in terms of your own experience of working at Manta and working in the space of lineage and data quality management, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned personally?
Well, certainly all of us for the last 20 plus years have been dealing with remote teams, remote working. So that's nothing new. But every company has a different culture, right? And I have to get used to that. So that was certainly one thing when I first got on board Manta 3 years ago, just working closely with the team that we have here in the United States, as well as we have engineering offices in the Czech Republic, as well as just opened one in Lisbon, Portugal. So dealing with that. But I have to say, probably one of the biggest challenges, and this is not a technical one, but the transition that Manta and all of our fellow vendors, competitors or not in this space, in their transition to a subscription licensing model. That was really an interesting transition that requires everyone from engineering through our sales force and our customer success teams have to rethink how we address working with a customer when it's not a perpetual license that has a maintenance fee, but in fact, it's a whole new license subscription for every single year. And I started my career in customer support. So I like this because what it does is it puts a whole new focus on the customer that everyone in the company needs to ensure that this customer is satisfied and happy. And, a passion of mine is providing value to the customer in why they're purchasing and working with your software. And by going to the subscription model, it's forced everyone to focus on the user and their experience. And I know that's not a technical scenario, but it certainly impacts everybody. And I think, listeners who are dealing with different software companies, if they've been through this transition, and I know some companies are still going through it, I would expect that they will find a better relationship with their vendor over time, for sure. That's a real big one.
For people who are interested in being able to take advantage of these lineage capabilities and be able to populate a lineage graph, both from push-based and discovery-based workflows, or being able to just understand what are the data flows in their organization, what are the cases where Manta is the wrong choice?
I would say, looking at who we help the most are the sites that have huge heterogeneous lineage issues because they have tools across the board on many different platforms with many different skill sets and across kind of the history of their organization. A site that has very narrow scenarios, that only has Snowflake. There's going to be other solutions out there that are going to help that site, probably cheaper, that can focus on just what they need in that one little space and provide the kind of lineage that they require because their number of variables are very small. So I'd say, small organizations with narrow technology, love to help them, but I think that they'll also find a lot of good solutions out there that don't need the Neo4j for millions of assets, and they don't need the broad spectrum of scanner types that we offer.
And as you continue to build and iterate on the Manta platform and explore the different use cases for Lineage and some of the different types of information that people want to track, what are some of the things you have in store for the near to medium term, or any projects that you're excited to dig into?
A couple of things. I think first and foremost, I did mention that, we're very close to putting out a commercial SaaS offering. We've done the work that is required to be containerized so we can fully support it. And so we're excited to do that. We think that'll open up new avenues for Manta, even within the current technology framework that we have today. But really where we'll see a lot of new development for us in particular is in making Lineage continually easier to consume and to automate the kinds of things that it can identify for you, right? So today, you can get information out of Manta that would help, in my example before, that Tobias wants to understand that a particular store procedure that he cares about has changed. But to actually, put that into the tooling so you can create your subscription yourself, and Manta will just automatically notify you or send you a Slack message. So being able to do some of those automated rules is crucial. Being able to increase the number of people in a company that are comfortable with Lineage. Lineage still tends to be something that leans technical, but being able to branch that out so that users who are maybe not pure business users like the CEO themselves, but more business-oriented users are going to feel comfortable to look at Lineage. And so our color coding pioneered that early on. Continually to making that easier is significant for us. The next thing really is continuing to expand our portfolio. We talked a little bit about, Open-Lineage, but there are also so many other new technologies that are coming out today and tomorrow that our customers are requesting of us. They're all across the board in the different categories. And the last one I would say is starting to see the need for customers that want to track not just classic tools, but be able to look at something like the APIs that they have, like having a crawler that will read through a Swagger page and be able to help illustrate the lineage of those APIs that are established. That's not like, just going into the next ETL tool that was invented, but really kind of looking at the things that people are doing to try and create standardized interfaces across their organization.
Are there any other aspects of the Manta product or the overall space of data lineage and its applications to data systems that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think exploring the rich application information that we have, doing it visually is one thing, doing it with APIs is another, trying to make intelligent decisions about notifying people when changes happen. And, that's all important stuff. But we know so much about someone's application that being able to measure its complexity, being able to identify opportunities for better performance, because we know all the paths that data is flowing through an organization. That type of deep analysis is where we're really also excited to take the Manta platform.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think the integration between all the different tools and technology. And, coming from my experience at IBM, where we had a single platform with lots of integrated, tools that did governance and ETL and data quality and stuff. Even there, with a single platform, customers still had lots and lots and lots of other solutions that were pulled into their company, either because it was historical or because people have their own budgets and can do what they want, or simply there was a desire to have some best of breed solution that is dealing with data. So even when you're in that environment, you're dealing with so many different platforms and tools that trying to get them all together and talk to each other is a massive problem. And, we talked about Open Lineage a lot today. Another initiative that Manta is involved with, and I was involved with, had the pleasure of being with the team when I was with IBM, is working with an initiative called Egeria. It's also sponsored by the ODPI and the Linux Foundation. And this is a standard for open metadata. And if everybody really could cooperate there, then it would alleviate so much friction that companies deal with as they try and get tools to talk to each other and share information. Now, of course, there's a lot of roadblocks there, right? People have proprietary models. People don't want to share everything. And so, these initiatives have been slowly evolving, but they're starting to get more momentum. And we certainly believe in those efforts. I think they're a long way from wholesale industry adoption. But with that being the biggest gap, we need that in order to help customers really get, I want to say, frictionless connections between all these tools. And until we do so, that gap will continue to remain.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you and your team at Manta are doing. It's definitely a interesting product and an important space for the data ecosystem. So I appreciate all of the time and energy that you and your team are putting into building the product that you are and contributing to help grow and expand and improve that ecosystem. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Tobias. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.